Jack Fleck always escapes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of 60 Minutes of Stone. This is Stone Gasman, and today we are going to be doing a very, very special episode. I'm very, very excited to share with you. We're primarily going to be talking about 4 films, a quartet of films, and their respective physical media releases. All 4 films are have a common thread because they are all directed by Richard Franklin. Now, Richard Franklin was a director who had gone to USC, and he was extremely passionate about Alfred Hitchcock. He loved Alfred Hitchcock films. He studied them. He analyzed them. He worshipped them. Alfred Hitchcock was not only his inspiration for going into film, ever since he saw Psycho at the age of 12, but he always had the idea, I would love to work with the master someday. And he never thought he would have that opportunity to shadow him and become his protege on 2 productions that Alfred Hitchcock was responsible for, Topaz and his last film, Family Plot. So for this episode, I'm going to primarily focus on 4 films and their physical media releases. I mean, we will provide a little bit more information about Richard Franklin's other films, which quite frankly, due to their lack of availability and due to the fact that they're not really horror thrillers, the majority of them, I will not focus on those. I am focused on his first 4 Hitchcockian thrillers, which include 1978's Patrick, 1981's Road Games, 1983's Psycho 2, and finally Cloak and Dagger in 1984. And like I said, we'll briefly talk about some of his other films, and cover all that. But we're mostly going to focus on these 4, and I'm very excited. So let's get started. So to start things off, our first movie is going to be Patrick, as you can see right now. This is the brand new Indicator Powerhouse release of Patrick. And one thing you will notice right away, was the original artwork for the poster. On the back of this, it says, Patrick has a way with people, his way. And that was a tagline that was provided for several other international posters for this movie. But look, some people thought he was crazy. He appeared to be deaf, dumb, and blind. None of them knew the sixth sense, the power of Patrick's mind. And as you can see, that title is very, very similar to the title of Psycho. I mean, as you can see, like the streak, the crack going through here, instead of the letters being cracked, we have like a hospital machine to let you know what life is left. Now, what is Patrick about? This is a crazy movie to say the least. And yes, it is very much in the Hitchcock vein. Even though Richard Franklin had made a couple bawdy comedies in Australia, they weren't very successful. Well, one was successful because it was kind of a softcore porn called Phantasm. And with that, I mean, that made a little bit of money. So he was able to secure enough funding to make Patrick his first Hitchcockian film. Now, what you will see right now is the Indicator Powerhouse artwork. Isn't that gorgeous right there? And this is a limited edition. This is number 430. They put out 10,000 copies of this. They put out 10,000 copies of this Blu-ray only a few weeks ago. 6,000 of which are 4K's exclusive, and 4,000 are Blu-ray exclusive. So if you want your copy, you need to order one because it is limited edition and it is region free. Now, to start, I would like to read a couple paragraphs from the very first essay, Australian Psycho, An Appreciation of Patrick by Alan Miller, which was provided for this 80-page booklet, as you can see right here. Yes, that is the titular Patrick, about to possess all of you with his psychokinesis. Yeah. So Here we go. This is the first two paragraphs of Alan Miller's essay for Australian Psycho in Appreciation of Patrick. What a difference a letter makes. In 1970, the Australian Classification Board opened the floodgates, establishing the R rating for restricted exhibition to prevent adult content being banned outright. Homegrown filmmakers responded swiftly. For producers, exploitation cinema seemed the safest box office bet. For directors, even those with higher artistic aspirations, making movies propelling softcore sex, violence, and horror to the fore meant experience. It was as if the independent spirit of Hollywood's undisputed master of exploitation, Roger Corman, had gone down under with his canonical blessing. In the United States, Corman was directly responsible for giving some of Hollywood's most famous filmmakers their humble exploitative start. In Australia, so-called Ozploitation would revitalize the country's film industry. Between 1970 and 1985, almost 400 features were made, more than the entire national industry had produced up until that point. If you proved yourself as a director and if your producers made a profit from your work, it gave you leverage to make films that you really wanted to make. And if they broke you through internationally, then Hollywood came knocking, as we will soon find out with Richard Franklin. World-renowned filmmakers like George Miller, Peter Weir, and Bruce Beresford all graduated from the crucible of Ozploitation and the Australian New Wave. To appreciate and celebrate the haunting lyricism of Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock, it seemed you needed to accept the freneticism of the Cars that Ate Paris, the lowest common denominators enabling higher artistic achievements. There's a worthy trade-off, and presumably after a picnic and a main course, there were full stomachs all around, a win-win. Someone else perfectly timed and situated the surf that wave was an ex-student of arguably the most globally recognized film school at the University of Southern California. Returning to his native Australia to kickstart his directorial career, Richard Franklin had made a name for himself at USC by encouraging the study of older Hollywood directors, or hacks, as his tutors witheringly called them, hacks like John Ford and Alfred Hitchcock. No joke. They were considered hacks by USC professors in the 60s. Oh, man. Having first encountered Psycho at the age of 12, Franklin began studying the oeuvre of the master of suspense. This was the 60s, and to see older films, you had to rely on repertory cinemas and the odd television screening. While at university, Franklin was keen to get his hands on a copy of Rope, the director's 1948 experiment in extended single takes. After putting in a formal request, a few days later, he was called out of a lecture to take a phone call. Mr. Franklin asked an unmistakable, sepulchral English voice,
Why have you asked for a print of my film?
Yes, indeed, it was Alfred Hitchcock. This was a first contact between master and student that would lead to Franklin's acclaimed sequel, Psycho 2, in 1983. Patrick was a stepping stone in that journey. Absolutely. It is most definitely a stepping stone in that journey to his masterpiece of Psycho 2. Now, what is Patrick about? Well, screenwriter Everett DeRoche was inspired by apparently a real-life patient named Patrick who apparently ended up in the hospital. He ended up quadriplegic, and evidently he had tried to commit suicide after he found his wife in bed with another man. Well, he didn't end up dying, and in fact, apparently it improved the sex life between husband and wife as he was in the hospital as a quadriplegic. This was according to the nurse that told Everett DeRoche this story. Now, that being said, it was, certain things were changed around. And yes, while it is about a young man named Patrick, instead of quadriplegic, he ends up comatose. And instead of jumping out of the window to try to commit suicide, he attempted matricide by throwing a heater in the bathtub where his mother was playing around with a guy, obviously not his father. Now, as you know, Hitchcock's most famous film, Psycho, which of course Richard Franklin saw when he was 12 years old is indeed about matricide. And but here again, I mean, and also in the film he refers to telekinesis as psychokinesis. There is a neon sign that is very reminiscent of the Bates Motel neon sign in Psycho. Um, at this hospital where they shot the film in Melbourne. Very, very small budget. And like I said, this young man, he attempts matricide. He ends up in a coma. We don't know exactly how, but it doesn't really matter. And a new nurse comes to this hospital and is, of course, assigned the night shift, taking care of Patrick in his solitary room. And she comes to find out that he can communicate through spitting. What she understood is that there was absolutely no hope of recovery for Patrick, and that the doctor was basically keeping him alive for the purpose of actually demented research, finding out when the soul left the body and that kind of thing. But yeah, he remains strapped to a hospital bed on a dialysis machine, and he's only able to communicate through spitting. And what he basically spooks the entire hospital staff, except for this one nurse who has, a lot of strength, and she figures out what Patrick's little game is here. Now, and there's a cornucopia of references to Hitchcock, of homages to Hitchcock. They are all over the place in this film, primarily Psycho. But at the same time, what's interesting is that this was actually primarily based. I mean, even though there's a lot of allusions to the films in Patrick, Richard Franklin actually borrowed from the pilot of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, his long-running famous television series from the 50s and 60s, an episode called Breakdown, which I believe was the 5th episode in season 1, starring Joseph Cotton. And where Cotton plays cynical movie producer William Carew, and he dictates a letter while relaxing in the sun with friend Ed Johnson, and Carew fires a longtime employer. Hoopka over the phone and scoffs at his crying. Later, while driving on a rural detour, Carew gets into a car accident and is completely paralyzed, other than being able to move his left pinky finger. After crashing into a prison guard and multiple vehicles, he is robbed by escaped convicts, one played by Aaron Spelling, of all people, who later became a famous television producer, who ignore him and leave him for dead. 2 more convicts come by shortly afterward and take his clothes. Finally, the sheriff arrives after catching a prisoner at the morgue. Worker Lloyd and the ambulance driver discuss the escape in the corner, and his assistant order William to be left for the night. Just when Carew is about to be declared legally dead, he saves himself at the last minute by getting the attention of Dr. Harner and his friend Chessie with his tease. Supporting cast, Raymond Bailey, Forrest Stanley, Harry Shannon, and Lane Chandler. So despite the fact that he was already an expert student on Hitchcock, Richard Franklin, and had run through all of the Masters films that were available at that time. And remember, this was limited availability. This was years before, physical media, and you can only hopefully to see Hitchcock films in art houses. Although there have been some Hitchcock films that have been suppressed, and weren't even released until 4 years after his death. But at the same time, Patrick, it's got great performances, great special effects. It's very, very chilling, very, very spooky. I mean, the actor that plays Patrick, he spends the entire movie like this. Literally. The entire movie, just basically his eyes bulged out. He barely moves in this film. I'm not going to give anything away. Because I'm sure for first-time viewers, you want to go in as cold as possible. Well, let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot recommend Patrick highly enough. For Richard Franklin's first Hitchcockian thriller, it is not quite near perfect, but it is very effective. Wonderful sense of humor, great characters, and well built up shocks and spooks. and it just everything works so beautifully. And it's wonderful that Indicator Powerhouse put out this gorgeous set. I mean, like I said, 6,000 4Ks, 4,000 Blu-rays. And now let me go ahead and tell you real quick about the video quality and all that stuff, and then the extras. Video quality, color balance complaints over at Blu-ray.com, and some problematic areas, but overall, quote, delineation, clarity, and depth are consistently very pleasing. Image stability is outstanding too. Yeah, I mean, Patrick, you can tell it's a film made from 1978, but it's never looked this good. It's really never looked this good. Now, audio quality. There's basically 3 tracks. There's an English DTS HD Master Audio 1.0. That's for the Australian theatrical version, which is basically the director's cut. Even though the film started out about 140 minutes, Richard Franklin did try to get that version through. The Australian version ended up being 113 minutes. And despite being a massive hit worldwide, Patrick was indeed a worldwide hit. A worldwide hit. I mean, it broke records in Italy, and it actually inspired an unofficial sequel, which was met with disdain by the original filmmakers. And in fact, the second audio track is an Italian master audio with English subtitles. So, and the great thing about the Italian version is that, well, it's 102 minutes, so it's about 11 minutes less than the Australian theatrical version. And the Italian version is marked by a great score by this famous band called Goblin, which was the band responsible for the scores for George Romero's Dawn of the Dead and also Suspiria, Dario Argento's Suspiria, 2 legendary classics from 1978, absolute horror classics. And Patrick is another classic from that year, too. So that's insane. Goblin did 3 scores that year: Dawn of the Dead, Patrick, and Suspiria. Or Suspiria 76. Never mind. It might be 76 or 78. Doesn't matter. But they are still, there's still 3 awesome scores. And then there's an English LPCM 1.0, and that is for the US version. Now, apparently they decided to chop out about 26 minutes, of footage, and they also dubbed. Now, all the characters. They dubbed all the characters in American English. And even though what's frustrating is that Richard Franklin deliberately wanted to use Queen's English for most of the primary characters so they don't sound Australian English. In fact, he minimized the Australian accents because he didn't necessarily want to have the audience think that this movie was set and shot in Australia. So, he uses Queen's English, and it's wonderful to hear. The Australian theatrical version is definitely my preferred version. And despite the fact that the Goblin score is very good, I prefer the original score by Brian May, which is actually used for the American version. But again, the American version is chopped up by at least 26 minutes, and it's not the ideal way to view Patrick. There are also English SDH and English subtitles for the Italian version, like I said. And so for the Blu-ray bonus material, here's where, this beautiful release is packed with some wonderful extras. First up, we have an audio commentary by director Richard Franklin. And this is a little bizarre in that he talks for about 95% of the movie, and then about halfway through the movie, Everett DeRoche comes in and actually provides maybe 5 minutes worth of commentary. They weren't recorded together, as it wasn't implied on the packaging, but I was kind of hoping they would be recorded together because obviously they were also very good friends. I mean, they worked on other films together, as we will talk about. But yeah, it's a superb audio commentary. And as I've discovered, and I really love the fact that director Richard Franklin is very candid. He is very candid and even a little incendiary at times in not only his commentaries, but also his interviews, of which there'll be plenty on the 4 films and their physical media releases that I'm talking about for this second episode of 60 Minutes of Stone. Now, After the commentary, we have a 20-minute on-set interview with director Richard Franklin, and I did include a quote here from that particular interview, which I love. Quote, "Suspense isn't action, it's waiting for action," unquote. There is a 9-minute on-stage interview with Richard Franklin, which includes, it's actually a little surreal because they actually show him a clip of the exploitation Italian knockoff Patrick Still Lives. Has nothing to do with the original film, and it contains some rather graphic stuff. I mean, when I refer to Patrick as Ozploitation, there is a little bit of nudity, there is a little bit of blood, there's a little bit of you know adult stuff in it, but it's actually a PG movie, and it's extremely tame, especially compared to Patrick Still Lives. And while I have not seen Patrick Still Lives, I have seen the 2013 remake, which was directed by the gentleman that did the Not Quite Hollywood documentary about exploitation, and that is, of course, dedicated to Richard Franklin, who passed away in 2007, and he only passed away only 4 days before his 59th birthday, which is very, very, very sad. And there's also a coffee break with producer Anthony I. Janane, which runs 18 minutes, where the producer talks in length about his career and particularly the international success of Patrick. And like I said, this was a success. It was a worldwide hit. The Not Quite Hollywood interviews include Susan Penhaligon, who plays the nurse, the lead nurse, Rod Molinar, who plays her husband, director Richard Franklin, Everett DeRoche, and Anthony I. Janane. And those interviews combined for about 62 minutes. Yeah, and we got more. We got more coming up. There's also Stephen Morgan in Shock Tactics, where he talks about the movie, and he provides a lot of information about the making of it and how it was made. We also have a French title sequence comparison that runs 3 minutes. Trailers and TV spots, image galleries, promotional materials, and BT and behind the scenes. And then we have this limited edition 80-page book with a new essay by Alan Miller, which I had read from, exclusive extracts from director Richard Franklin. There he is right there shooting Patrick. Producer Anthony I. Janane's unpublished memoirs and archival interviews with screenwriter Everett DeRoche, special effects supervisor Conrad Rothman, and also full film credits. And I also wanted to read the last 2 paragraphs of that essay here real quick before we move on any further. Made in 1978, Patrick cannot help but show its age, but the film gave Franklin his first opportunity to flex his suspense muscles, and despite the low budget and the scale of the production, he succeeds in generating a few nail-biting moments and evoking no little sympathy for the heroine. The action is staged well, and given its running time of just over 112 minutes, there's not a dud or unnecessary scene in the whole film. As the poster proclaims, it is a suspense thriller, but it's also a surprisingly rich character drama with depths exploitation films rarely explore. Ironically, the film was an international hit, albeit controversially recut and dubbed for U.S. distribution with American voices. Whilst in its native land, its business was seen as disappointing. That's very true. Franklin died far too young, and from the malicious disease he called Jack the Dancer. We maintained a prodigious email correspondence right to his passing in 2007. He was a close friend, and cinema is all the poorer without him. Yeah, very, very, very sad. And I also wanted to read these first few paragraphs from Franklin's excerpts from his unpublished autobiography. Everett DeRoche had written the script, emulating The Exorcist, though the story was inspired by a true story here from a nurse about a quadriplegic in a Sydney hospital who had been injured when he attempted to fake a suicide jump from his bedroom window after finding his wife in bed with another man. Once paralyzed, however, apparently their sex life improved, and the nurses used to smuggle her into his room at night. Everett's screenplay began with a man jumping from a building and having his fall cushioned by a car. I suggested we change the backstory to Matricide as little more than a homage to Psycho, but it served us well. A suicidal being, a difficult character to motivate, let alone ask an audience to identify with. That is very, very, very true. In Rapid Fire, Patrick won the Best Director award at Sitges in Spain, and then Best Picture at Alvor Riaz in France. I attended the Cannes Film Festival in 1978, was able to go to win the Best Picture from the Science Fiction Academy. Anyway, my recollection is of buyers beating the doors down to get to the commercial picture from Down Under with the amazing shock ending. In fact, I'm not going to read this part because it's going to give it away. But his wife, Denise, and I had gone into a marquee and been shocked by a man who ran at the rubber bars of his cage and passed through to grab my new wife. Unarmed patroon that I am, I ran from the tent and crept sheepishly back a minute or so later. Had I been armed, I might have been tempted to shoot. Yes, absolutely. And yeah, see, so here's the memories of the producer essay right there, just to show. Yeah, and I'll show a few more pictures here. It's a really nice booklet. Really, really nice booklet. There's the screenwriter, Everett DeRoach, who wrote Patrick. Patrick as much a love story as a mystery thriller? It's a monster story, and I cut anything that didn't relate to Patrick as a monster. One of the first things to go was the romantic aspect. And there's one, I thought there was one especially interesting thing here, an interview with the special effects Conrad Rothman right there. And I especially love this. I wanted to share this real quick as well. What scene in the film required the air mortar? Well, Patrick becomes enraged in one scene and uses a cabinet full of medical supplies as a weapon. The doors fly wide open and the supplies explode out of the cabinet and fly around the room. To achieve this air mortar was placed about 2 meters behind the cabinet. We removed the back of the cabinet and all sharp, dangerous, or heavy objects from inside. The cabinet doors we operated with a monofilament fishing line. The air mortar muzzle was then filled with 5,000 or 6,000 pills of different types, plastic pill bottles, caps, towels, anything that wouldn't be a danger to the actress Susan Penhaligon. To avoid any injury, Susan turned her back during the firing and Patrick covered his eyes. The mortar had been about 10 cubic feet tank pumped up to about 8 pounds of pressure. It emptied in less than a second and blew the stuff right through the cabinet into the room. The air blast traveling around the room lifted the objects and kept them in flight. The plastic pill bottles were light, so they flew around the room. The shot was shot in slow motion, which enhanced the otherworldly quality and produced a very nice effect. Yes, produced a very nice effect. And yeah, finally, and also the notes on the transfer right here. That's the last thing I wanted to share with you about the restoration. Patrick was scanned in 4K from the original 35 millimeter negative preserved at the National Film and Sound Archive of Australia by Fixa Film. The film's audio was captured from the original sound negative by the NFSA. Picture restoration and color correction work were carried out by Renaissance Films in the UK. Thousands of instances of dirt were removed, scratches, stains, and other imperfections eliminated, and frames repaired. Damaged frames repaired, excuse me. No grain management, edge enhancement, or sharpening tools were employed to artificially alter the image in every way. And like I said, this is brand new. This just came out a few weeks ago. It's a limited edition. Pick up your copy when you can get a chance of Richard Franklin's Patrick. Now, his second Hitchcockian thriller came out in 1981. He had produced a movie called The Blue Lagoon for Columbia Pictures, and while it was laughed off the screen and became a very controversial film, it was from the director of Grease, Randall Kleiser, and it was based on a 1903 Seam novel about two young children who are, they end up off their ship and they end up on a deserted island. But when their one adult mentor dies, they end up discovering love and sex for the very first time. And Brooke Shields, who plays the girl, actually has a baby. Well, look, The Blue Lagoon may not be a great film, but I have a soft spot for it. It was written by Douglas Day Stewart, who also wrote An Officer and a Gentleman. And Richard Franklin has a co-producer credit. But while they were shooting the movie in the Fiji Islands, Richard Franklin actually basically did two things during the Blue Lagoon. He hung out with Brooke Shields' mother while they were shooting, and he was also working with Everett DeRoach, who was in a hotel room as they wrote their second Hitchcockian thriller called Road Games. And this came out in 1981 and stars Stacy Keach and Jamie Lee Curtis, although Jamie Lee Curtis only appears for like 20 minutes. Her casting in this movie, because of the fact that this was an Australian movie, it has a lot of American influence. I mean, yes, Richard Franklin is Australia, Australian. But the two leads, Stacy Keach and Jamie Lee Curtis, are American actors, and there were people from America on the crew. And so there was a lot of questioning by the Australian press at the time. Is this really an Australian film, or is it not an Australian film? Now, Road Games, first of all, what is Road Games about? Well, Stacy Keach plays an American who is driving a truck. He doesn't call himself a truck driver. He just says he's driving a truck across the outback in Australia, the empty outback. His only companion is a dingo, and the real life dog's name was Killer, although Stacy Keach said it was the sweetest dog in the world. He loved that dog so much he wanted to adopt it. And what's great about the script by Everett DeRoche is that while this gentleman who drives this truck has nobody to talk to except for this dog, that enables him to get away to speaking out loud while he's driving, even though he's not really talking to anybody but the dog in the seat. And yeah, we do get a few reactions of the dog, but it's not really about their relationship. It is about this serial killer that apparently is picking up women all over the outback, very young hitchhikers, and strangling them, and then dumping their bodies on the side of the in the outback, and basically burying them in the desert. And it was, here again, based on Patrick's success and, of course, the wild success of Blue Lagoon, which made $58 million at the box office and was number 9 in 1980. Here again, not a great film, and yes, I can understand why it got Razzie nominations, but it's still not bad, just saying. But, Franklin got a little bit of money. He got a little bit of clout because of those two films, Patrick and Blue Lagoon. And so he got Road Games. But the problem is that the budget for this one had been stretched really, really thin. They had to shoot the movie on locations all across the outback as they were going from Melbourne all the way to Perth, and we really notice it. And the bonus features has just every story that you can imagine during the production of this movie, and it's very much Richard Franklin's version of Rear Window. There are shots that specifically make you think of Rear Window, but also Rebecca, and also North by Northwest. Here again, another wonderful pastiche of Hollywood nods and references, and as you could say, tips of the hat, to the master. And this, of course, was right after Alfred Hitchcock passed away in 1980. I don't think he was able. They don't mention in the Patrick bonus features if he had seen that, but unfortunately, he missed out on Road Games, which he probably would have been. He probably would have liked it. I mean, now. So and here again, it's about this serial killer, and the trucker is figuring things out while he's driving on the road. And we also follow all the other motorists that are going along parallel with everybody else, with this killer and this American truck driver. And so we eventually meet Jamie Lee Curtis, and they got a nice chemistry. Stacy Keach and Jamie Lee Curtis, they have a really nice chemistry. And there's a wonderful scene at a roadhouse where there's this, Richard Franklin does this ambitious 180 degree turn as we look at the entire roadhouse and discover what all the characters are and who we're going to see later and who we're not going to see later. But it really gives us an idea, like in North by Northwest during the crop dusting sequence, it really gives us an idea of how isolated these characters are from the rest of the world. I mean, they're basically in the middle of a scorching desert, and Stacy Keach told the story numerous times in the bonus features about how he and Jamie Lee would just go out and have some fun when they weren't shooting. And but there was like a slew of caterpillars all over the road being driven over. And what they were informed of was that there were jumping venomous spiders all over Australia. Yeah, this is a thing, and they were very, very lucky that no jumping spiders attacked them, because they probably would have been they probably would not have been able to make it to the hospital, and that would have really destroyed the production if one of the stars had died. Can you imagine if Jamie Lee Curtis had gotten bit by a jumping spider during the making of this movie? I mean, yeah, it would have been really sad because, of course, her career skyrocketed only a few years after the first two Halloween movies. But it was actually during the shooting of The Fog where Richard Franklin met Jamie Lee Curtis because he was very good friends with John Carpenter. You know, Jamie Lee Curtis was in Halloween. She was also in The Fog, and then she was also in Halloween 2. And she made a couple other horror films early on, including Terror Train, which I have on Blu-ray, as well as Prom Night, which I think is the worst of the movies that she made of the horrors. Now, Road Games is very much a thriller. It really distinguishes itself as a genuine Hitchcockian suspense thriller, just like Patrick. And like I said, we get the sense of isolation, the heat, and the fact that you're in the middle of nowhere with a killer driving around you. That's pretty creepy. Excuse me, that's pretty creepy on its own, let alone anything else. Now, the video quality for this Shout Scream Factory Blu-ray, which is from 2019, a great edition, which is packed with bonus features. Just look at all those special features. Look at that. That is absolutely insane, all right? I'm going to leave that in front for a minute. But as for the video quality, there are no traces of problematic degrading corrections, but ideally grain should be better exposed and resolved. There are no traces of compromising sharpening adjustments. Colors are natural and healthy, but the overall dynamic range does fluctuate a bit. In fact, that there are a couple of different segments where it appears that brightness levels are elevated, and as a result, the primaries and some of the nuances lack proper balance. See the motel sequence and the flashing sign in every beginning of the film. Finally, there are some minor compression artifacts that sneak in, though they never become overly distracting. All in all, this is a very fine presentation of Road Games, but ideally the film should have even more convincing appearance on Blu-ray. Now, it is true that Indicator Powerhouse, I believe, put out a 4K version of Road Games only a few years ago. But the thing is that, I mean, those are, I believe, Region B locked. So I think the Shout Factory Blu-ray is the way to go, and you can still get this. And there is a slipcover for it. I like the new artwork. I like the new artwork for the movie as well. So I'm going to keep. This is a rare slipcover. I'm actually going to keep for the one for Road Games. Now, as for the bonus material, like I said, there is a lot of bonus material on this, and it took me a long time to sit through and watch everything. But let me go list it here. Audio quality, there's just a DTS HD Master Audio 2.0 and English SDH subtitles. We have an interview with Stacy Keach that lasts 14 minutes, a 1980 script read with Richard Franklin and actors Stacy Keach and Marion Edwards. A real find, a real find. Demos, Brian May music accompanied by stills and poster gallery. Brian May came back from Patrick to do the score for Road Games, and I think it's equally as great. Kangaroo Hitchcock, The Making of Road Games, 21 minutes, features interviews with Richard Franklin and Stacy Keach and Everett DeRoche, I believe. Great making of documentary that really complements the film. We also have 64 minutes of not quite Hollywood interviews. Yeah, we have a lot of those interviews, including Jamie Lee Curtis. This is the one interview that Jamie Lee Curtis gives on the film. She is divine. She is delightful. She has some wonderful stories to share. But she understood that, I mean, she unfortunately felt like she was in this position where she wasn't accepted in Australia because of the fact that she was an American actress. But very sad to say. But we also have a vintage lecture on the making of Road Games with Richard Franklin, co-producer Barbie Taylor, and composer Brian May, with questions answered, which runs 131 minutes. Yeah, that is definitely the big kahuna of this entire Blu-ray collector's edition from Shout Factory. It's just wonderful. We also have a 24-minute audio interview with Richard Franklin, a 25-minute vintage profile of Richard Franklin, a 10-minute audio interview of Stacy Keach, a 33-minute audio interview with stunt coordinator Grant Page, who also plays the killer of Road Games. We also have promotional materials in the trailer. Richard Franklin audio commentary moderated by Perry Martin, which was recorded way back for the Anchor Bay DVD back in the 2000s, and commentary with producer Mark Hartley, who was responsible for Not Quite Hollywood, director of photography Vincent Morton, production secretary Helen Watts, and costume designer Aphrodite Condos. And this commentary, this group commentary, is wonderful, and it really fills in a lot of the blanks that was left behind by Richard Franklin in his audio commentary with Perry Martin. And here again, things get a little juicy. We learn some behind the scenes stuff. That I never thought I would have imagined. A lot of juicy stories, a lot of compelling stories, including one time where they were arrested for impersonating police officers, and the police officers didn't believe them, that they were a film crew shooting a movie called Road Games. A really great story. But at the end of the commentary, I loved how they sum everything up at the end of the commentary. Look, we've told a lot of horror stories, but look, this was Richard Franklin's vision, and they were all proud to be a part of that vision. And that was wonderful to hear. Yeah, that's a lot of extras to swim through for Road Games. So that is the second of the films. Now, because of the success of Patrick, and Road Games wasn't really successful, but Patrick, when that was viewed by Universal executives after Alfred Hitchcock's death, and concurrently when Robert Bloch's sequel to Psycho was published in 1982 called Psycho 2, even though it has nothing to do with the movie Psycho 2, and Universal wanted to separate themselves from Robert Bloch's sequel, they set about making an actual sequel to Psycho, but they were worried that this wasn't going to be very accepted, and they were considering doing it as a made-for-TV movie with Christopher Walken, of all people, who had won an Academy Award for The Deer Hunter. I don't know why you would have an Academy Award winner headline a television movie, which is a sequel to one of the most influential movies of all time. But Universal was nervous about this. They weren't sure that a sequel to Psycho would be absolutely accepted. Richard Franklin, the master's protege, of course, turned out to be the perfect candidate to helm Psycho 2. It was shot in the summer of 1982, released in the summer of 1983. It's 22 years later, and Norman Bates is coming home. And I do, in fact, consider this Richard Franklin's masterpiece. I think it's without a doubt, the finest of the four Hitchcockian thrillers that he made. Maybe not number one in my heart. I will get to that in a minute. But Psycho 2 definitely earns its due. It earns every amount of praise it has received over the years as being a amazing sequel, even to some a superior sequel. Not sure if I agree with that, but I have to admit it would probably top my ranking of the entire Psycho franchise, which also includes the remake, the Bates Motel TV movie, the Bates Motel TV show, which there's Vera Farmiga gracing the cover of the Bates Motel TV show. Wonderful stuff. Wonderful. So Psycho 2, it follows 22 years later after the original, where Norman Bates is let out of the asylum. He's been forgiven, at least by the law enforcement, by the town, and, is going to get another chance out in society to have a happy life. So he goes home, which probably was a mistake, but he ends up going home and acquires the old house again with the motel, and basically prepares to get back in business. But he decides to take a job at the local deli, which was actually a diner. Actually, he called it a diner, which was actually mentioned in the very first Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, of course. And what's interesting, I love the fact, I was going to mention that Richard Franklin, he does Hitchcock cameos. It was a necessity back in the silent era when they needed people to do minor tasks while shooting a movie. Well, Hitchcock actually appears in every single one of his films, believe it or not. Even in the 1944 classic Lifeboat, which has a bunch of survivors on a boat in the middle of the ocean. I'm not going to say where Hitchcock appears, but it is a genius cameo, to say the least. Well, Richard Franklin kind of does the same thing. I don't remember him appearing on screen anywhere in Patrick. Unfortunately, I just don't. In the film Road Games, I forgot to mention that Stacy Keach is transporting pork, Universal Meats, and then the next film, Richard Franklin, would be at Universal Pictures. This is a nice little connection there. But you see Richard Franklin at the end handling one of the pigs that was being transported in the truck in the frozen cab by Stacy Keach. In Psycho 2, it's brilliant that he appears in front of a video game in the diner in this town where the Psycho movies take place. And he all you see is him playing the video game, and you see him turn his head to his left as Norman Bates comes in. And it's a wonderful, wonderful cameo. And it kind of foreshadows his next directing film on the video game, which I'll get to in a minute. But he also has a cameo in that fourth film as well. So Psycho 2, I mean, Norman Bates is back. He's going to get back into the mode. But of course, Mother begins to haunt him again. And like I said, if you haven't seen it yet, you have to watch it. Even if you've always been worried about it living up to the original, trust me when I say that Richard Franklin more than makes up to the original. Like I said, this was Hitchcock's protege. If there's anybody I would entrust a Psycho 2 from, it would be him. The screenplay, however, was written by Tom Holland, who had written a script called The Beast Within, which was famous for its blow-up makeup effects. I mean, all the rage at the time with American Werewolf in London. But he wrote Psycho 2, and he got practically nothing but praise from critics, and from industry insiders. The Psycho 2 premiere, it had Alfred Hitchcock's relatives, descendants, including his own daughter. It had many people that were associated with the original Psycho, including Hilton Hay Green, who is now a executive producer. On the first film, he was Hitchcock's first AD. I believe they had the same script supervisor. They had a number of people that had already been associated with not only Hitchcock's family, but Hitchcock's team. And Janet Leigh was there at the premiere with Jamie Lee Curtis. Jamie Lee Curtis was originally suggested for the idea of being Janet Leigh's sister's daughter in Psycho 2. Lila, yeah, that's right, Vera Miles, who comes back for Psycho 2. And by the way, Vera Miles is still with us. She's in her 90s. Bless her heart. Bless her heart. She is interviewed in some of the promotional material from 1983 on the Blu-ray here, but we don't get any fresh interviews from her. We didn't even hear from her for the Making of Psycho documentary, which is on all the original Blu-rays and 4Ks. And by the way, the Psycho quadrilogy was released on 4K last year. Unfortunately, it is out of print, and there are a few differences in terms of extras and everything. But there's so much to dive into as well as that is concerned. But if you want 4K for Psycho movies, they are all available. You just have to look for them on eBay. And for Psycho 2, this is a collector's edition. Universal originally put Psycho out in a bare bones DVD and Blu-rays. Now we have a collector's edition version courtesy of Scream Factory, Shout Factory. And the extras maybe sound a little light here, but there is some good news I'll get to in a minute. But there is an audio commentary with Tom Holland, the screenwriter, hosted by Rob Galuzzo, who is the writer, producer, and director of the documentary The Psycho Legacy, which in fact is right here. Now, The Psycho Legacy, this came out in 2010, and it's an 87-minute documentary that basically looks at more or less the sequels. It does cover the original to some extent. See, this is a 2-disc edition that Shout Factory put out. And on the first disc is the documentary, which runs 87 minutes. On the second disc is 3 hours of bonus features. This thing is packed. And even though the Blu-ray for the Shout Factory edition of Psycho 2 is a little short, we have the audio commentary with Tom Holland. We also have vintage video and audio interviews, a vintage Universal electronic press kit, which is actually very fascinating. It runs 35 minutes, includes many interviews, including with Richard Franklin and Janet Leigh. There is an audio-only interview, which you can play with the film, which have different cast and crew interviews. And finally, that's about it, aside from gallery, a trailer, and TV spots, which add up to about 13 minutes. So while Psycho 2 on this Blu-ray seems a little light on bonus material, the Psycho Legacy has a second disc which has all this material, including revisiting Psycho 2 with writer Tom Holland and Psycho Legacy director Robert Galuzzo, where they look through the original blueprints, newspaper clippings, and articles and possessions left behind from Psycho 2 director Richard Franklin. And also Shooting Psycho 2, which is an interview with the cinematographer of the film, Dean Cundy, who had shot the John Carpenter films, Halloween, The Fog, Escape from New York. And he later on shot films like Romance in the Stone, Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and he shot Psycho 2, and just one of the great cinematographers of our time. And so there are plenty of other extras on the Psycho Legacy DVD. I just don't understand why Shout Factory didn't put some of these other extras on the Blu-ray. Surely they could have, especially since Rob Galuzzo was participating in both of them. They could have easily transferred some of the DVD extras from this set over to the Blu-ray. A minor complaint. It's not that big of a deal. And like I said, you can get the Psycho Legacy DVD for a very small price, especially if you want to collect the entire physical media collection for the Psycho films, except for the 4Ks from overseas, which unfortunately are now out of print. Now, finally, last but not least, we have come upon the fourth and final Hitchcockian thriller from director Richard Franklin. And it's a film that is very near and dear to my heart. It is the 1984 film Cloak and Dagger, starring Henry Thomas and Dabney Coleman. And yes, it is a Hitchcockian thriller in every way that Patrick is, Rogue Games, and Psycho 2 is. This is pure Hitchcock. And Richard Franklin wanted to essentially make a Hitchcock film for younger audiences, for, pre-teenagers and regular teenagers. And of course, Universal wanted to capitalize on Henry Thomas's success from Steven Spielberg's E.T. And so, what is Cloak and Dagger? This is a bizarre movie that was not a hit in 1984. Very, very sad. But it's based on an old Cornell Woolrich story called The Boy Cried Murder. And interesting to note that the word who is not in that title. It's just called The Boy Cried Murder. However, Richard Franklin actually referred to it, or actually, I think it was Tom Holland that actually referred to it by another name. I think it was Fire Escape, he referred it to. But it was basically like a junior version of Rear Window, at the Hitchcock film Rear Window. And it was made into a 1949 film called The Window with Bobby Driscoll. And Bobby Driscoll was, of course, famous for the Disney films. He gave the voice of Peter Pan. He was in Treasure Island, Song of the South, and remarkable child actor. He won an Academy Award for The Window. He was only 9 years old. And as you can see right there, it's a film noir, a well-crafted, high-tension film noir, claustrophobic in tone and harrowing in its impact. And it's basically about a boy with a very overactive imagination that witnesses a murder on the fire escape above his New York tenement apartment. Now, this was back at a time when there wasn't even AC in New York City. And of course, it was a dangerous place for kids to play, especially in such cramped, very hot conditions. Well, this was a big hit for RKO, and Universal wanted to use this story and Henry Thomas as the star and make a new version. But this is a Cloak and Dagger is really Tom Holland's original story. And what happened was instead they just used the skeletonized boy cried wolf scenario of the window or the boy cried murder and decided to use the MacGuffin, this video game, this Atari video game called Cloak and Dagger. And this was back when video games were brand new. They had just been released on the market in the early 1980s. And Atari was really the only game in town. This was long before Nintendo, long before Sega Genesis, and certainly long before the Xbox and all these other video game systems. And I would like to declare right now that I do believe, even though this might spark some debate among the video game enthusiasts, I believe the Cloak and Dagger is the very first official adaptation of a video game. Because the MacGuffin, the video game called Cloak and Dagger, but from Atari, used to be called Agent X. And so they used this video game as the MacGuffin for Henry Thomas, where he's given this video game from this FBI agent who gets shot and killed. There's a shot very reminiscent of Vertigo when he falls to his death. But nobody will believe him. Nobody will believe him that he witnessed this murder in this building. And it's set in San Antonio, by the way, because that's where Henry Thomas's hometown was. And so it was very convenient for him, because you got to remember that child actors, you have to schedule them very, very carefully. They only have a certain amount of hours because they got schoolwork to do. They still got to do what they have to do. But Henry Thomas was all into, video games and Universal actually went for him for advice about this character and this story. Like, what are kids doing now? And Henry Thomas said, playing video games, and just having fun. And that's why Henry Thomas, this movie is very personal to him. And this movie is very personal to me as well. I mean, I have seen Cloak and Dagger more times than any other movie, with the possible exception of Romance in the Stone, which I mentioned earlier, also shot by Dean Cundey. Now, this film, Tom Holland and director Richard Franklin had collaborated on Psycho 2. They were back for Cloak and Dagger, and Universal was hoping for a repeat of Psycho 2's success, where Henry Thomas is basically running all over San Antonio away from these very dangerous, very violent spies that are after this video game with stolen government plans, specifically the secrets to a very powerful weapon with an invisible bomber in a jet, which at the time was actually top secret. Nobody really knew about this stuff. And so it really hit upon a window in time where Atari was all the rage. Unfortunately, when the movie came out and the Cloak and Dagger was going to be used as a tie-in to sell the movie and the game concurrently, unfortunately, there was a video game crash. And so the movie flopped, and it basically disappeared into cable. Most people discovered Cloak and Dagger through cable. And I recorded my own audio commentary on the movie a couple years ago with some friends from Region Free, Born to Be Rad and Sheebie Jeebies. Wonderful cameo commentary. I get a few things wrong, but it's, for the most part, a very passionate commentary that you should all check out. But this Vinegar Syndrome 4K and Blu-ray is one of the most gorgeous physical media releases I have ever seen. Just look at that artwork. Just look at that. That is just incredible. Kudos to whoever did the artwork on this. This is just absolutely amazing. And that is Bill Forsyth, which you may know as William Forsyth. And he's been in many movies since then, like The Rock, Career Opportunities, many stuff. So just check this out. When you open this up, look at that gorgeous artwork. And you get the 4K and the Blu-ray in this one set. And this is another slip cover that I love. I just love the vintage. Look at that. That's like a sticker that's meshed on there. There's the Cloak and Dagger logo, and there's the back of it. As you can see, look at that stuff. That is so nostalgic. Very early 1980s. And here is the 4K itself. There's the plot synopsis, and there are all the extra features, which I will list here in a minute very, very quickly, because we're now at 60 minutes of Stone. There's the 4K and there's the Blu-ray. And yes, this is a limited edition, so you better pick up your copies as soon as you can. And like I said, Psycho 2 may be Richard Franklin's masterpiece, but Cloak and Dagger is number one in my heart. I mean, and it is essentially a Hitchcock movie for kids that becomes a very elaborate and ambitious spy adventure. And there are some scenes of tension in this movie which are almost unbearable. There's a wonderful scene on the actual San Antonio River on those boats, and I always love the boat captain on there that keeps telling the spies to sit down. It is a very, very tense sequence. And, and there's tense sequences all throughout. And like I said, I mean, if you've never seen it, shut this off right now and go watch it before you listen to another word. And also watch my commentary because I give away a lot of stuff on there that is very, very important. And that's why I'm going to cut this short for Cloak and Dagger. But also there's this collector's booklet, which includes a 42-page essay. That's what the plans look like in the cartridge. There's Henry Thomas. War Games, Cloak and Dagger, video games, and selling espionage to children. Richard Franklin opens his 1984 video game-influenced espionage film for kids, Cloak and Dagger, with a seemingly real-world sequence of covert warfare. In these opening minutes, the audience is introduced to secret agent Jack Flack, played by Dabney Coleman, a mustachioed, beret-wearing force of violence who enters the frame falling from the sky via an American flag-adorned parachute shortly before engaging in combat, wherein one man is stabbed in the chest with a machete and a woman is killed by a ricocheted bullet. Albeit a relatively bloodless sequence, it resembles the type of realistic violence that someone would expect from the prior year's similarly espionage-themed The Osterman Weekend. That is until giant 8-sided dice appear in the frame, and we are introduced to the RPG that the scene is actually a part of. Yeah, a really, really good essay. Really, really good essay that really covers a lot. I mean, and it has other pictures right there. And there's also a separate Tom Holland interview in the film as well. See, there's some wonderful shots of the movie. I'm not going to give too much away for those who haven't seen it yet. Among the bonus features, we have the collector's booklet. We also have a documentary called Konami Codes and Cult Classics, with interviews from writer Tom Holland, casting director Jackie Birch, second assistant director Alan B. Curtis, and actors Michael Murphy and Tammy Hyler, which runs 28 minutes. Loud and Clear, a brand new interview with Henry Thomas, which runs 14 minutes. There's a 1984 interview with Richard Franklin that lasts about 5 minutes. A 2001 interview with Richard Franklin that runs 13 minutes. Again, a very, very candid interview. And while he and Dabney Coleman had creative differences on the set, they were professionals. They put aside their differences, and they made, to me, one of the most wonderful movies I've ever seen in my life. And I am so grateful to both of them. There is also a then and now split screen locations comparison of all San Antonio locations, runs 4 minutes and 20 seconds. And there's also a 30-minute YouTube video of the Arcade Workshop Chronicles with host Cassandra Childs, or AKA Vintage Arcade Gal, who tells us all about the video game itself from Atari, Agent X, the 5200 mall game that was used in arcades and everything, and of course explaining and even showcasing her own Cloak and Dagger gameplay, taking apart the back of the console and everything. It's really fascinating stuff, and this release really needed that documentary, I think. There's also a still gallery running 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and TV spots, and the retro packaging is so wonderful, as I just showed you. Now, and those are the 4 Richard Franklin Hitchcockian thrillers. There's Patrick, Road Games, Psycho 2, Cloak and Dagger. I love them all. I do think that Psycho 2 and Cloak and Dagger from Universal, where he collaborated with Tom Holland, are just slightly better than the first 2, but I think all 4 of them are great. and you should all check them out, and definitely pick up some of these physical media releases before they're gone forever. This is without a doubt the definitive Richard Franklin um, uh, set, if you ask me. And like I said before, Cloak and Dagger is full of numerous Hitchcock references all over the place. And the one that made me slap me in my forehead was when I found out that the 39 Steps, the 1935 classic Hitchcock film, which made him a worldwide sensation from his native England, that is referenced. Tom Holland actually puts a deliberate reference to 39 Steps in Cloak and Dagger, which I did not see for all the billions of times I have seen it. And that is a testament to Tom Holland's skill as a screenwriter. I mean, after all, he worked later on Fright Night and Child's Play. And according to him on his Twitter page, he considers this his favorite of all his scripts. That's very true. He considers Cloak and Dagger his greatest achievement, and I don't blame him because it's wonderful. And you know what? It makes me cry. It makes me cry every single time because it's a wonderful father and son story embedded in a Hitchcockian suspense thriller with wonderful moments of spy adventure. And it's just, it remains underrated, but it's still a cult favorite in every way. And when I say it makes me cry, I am not kidding. It makes me cry. It's Dabney Coleman is wonderful. Henry Thomas is wonderful. And if you've never seen it, particularly if you're a Psycho 2 fan, you absolutely must see it. And to be honest, that's about it in covering the Richard Franklin retrospective. I mean, he did make a few other suspense thrillers, including his very last one called Visitors, which unfortunately is kind of tainted by the direct-to-video aspect of the whole thing, but it's not bad. And he also did a movie called Link with Everett DeRoche about these apes and with Elizabeth Shue. Aside from the performance from the apes themselves, it's not really all that memorable, sad to say. It was a real come down after Cloak and Dagger. And then he did the sequel FX2. The original was superior, but the second one is kind of fun. It's lesser Franklin, but it's still decent Franklin. There were a couple of movies I weren't able to see, including Running Delilah with what's her name from Sex and the City, Kim Cattrall and Billy Zane. Unfortunately, it's only available on an out-of-print DVD, so I wasn't able to watch it. And that is the same thing with Hotel Sorrento, where Richard Franklin finally won in his native country in Australia. He finally won a Australian Academy Award for writing Hotel Sorrento, adapting it for the stage. And granted, Patrick was nominated for Best Film in 1978. Road Games got several nominations. 7 nominations between Patrick and Road Games, but he didn't win until Hotel Sorrento. And he did a few other television movies called Brilliant Lies and One Way Ticket. So, but that's it. I mean, Cloak and Dagger, Psycho 2, Patrick, and Road Games are the ones you have to check out. They are all, brilliant or near brilliant. And it just showcases the absolute best of the master's apprentice, the master's protege. And rest in peace, Richard Franklin. Thank you so much for directing these films. They will always remain in my physical media collection, and I adore all of them. So that is the second episode of 60 Minutes of Stone. Glad you can join me. And just to give you a very brief preview of what I'll be doing for episode 3 for May, I will be doing a retrospective of director Kat Shea. From her 1980s acting roles to her writing directing ventures with Corman's Concord Company, Kat Shea has carved out an exciting and unique resume with a nary a fatal misstep, as every single movie is at least watchable, and a couple are visceral, potent gems, which all deserve attention and discussion nearly 4 decades after she entered the business. We shall cover all of her horror thrillers, from Strip to Kill, which we have right here on this Scorpion release, Strip to Kill, as well as the sequel Rage Carrie 2. So we shall be covering the films of Kat Shea, all pretty much horror thrillers, from Strip to Kill all the way to the Rage Carrie 2. Thank you very much for joining me for episode 2 of 60 Minutes of Stone for the Richard Franklin Retrospective. And you all have a wonderful day. Thank you very much for joining me.